It is my great honor to congratulate you, Professor Achille Mbembe, with the Holberg Prize 2024, and to welcome you to this conversation. I must admit that there is so many things I would like to discuss with you here, not the least because of the urgent times we are living in, which poses vast challenges to humanity, facing new and ever more advanced technologies, climate change and loss of biodiversity, violence and war on the rise globally, all of which you have addressed in your extensive philosophical and historical writings. Let me, in that regard, begin by quoting from the Holberg press release, which situates you both as one of the foremost thinkers of post-colonial Africa, addressing issues such as the production of race and racism, and a key critical theorist of the planetary. Mbembe, they write, and here I quote, is one of the most read and cited scholars from the African continent and receives the prize for his pioneering research in African history, post-colonial studies, humanities, and social sciences for over 4 decades. Both as an academic and as a public intellectual, he is known for his ability to bridge existing thinking on colonialism and decolonialization with the pressing questions on topics such as contemporary migration regimes, global citizenship, restitution and reparation, technology, climate change, and planetary futures. In your own words, being asked to describe the key purpose of your work, you point out that the main questions that drive your research are: what are the conditions for rethinking the world in a way that opens up alternative ways of inhabiting it, of being in common, and of nurturing a planetary consciousness? And how to think an open future that moves beyond the history of race, colonialism, and segregation with which the present is deeply entangled. These questions, you state, have been at the heart of your research over the span of your career. Behind them lurks an even bigger issue, that of life futures. How can life be repaired, reproduced, sustained, and cared for, made durable, and universally shared? I cannot think of a better place to start this conversation. So, to begin with, can you explain for us what you mean by a planetary consciousness? And then, to follow up, can you, as a philosopher, a historian, and an intellectual, give us some perspectives on what critical thinking can offer us in this regard? In other words, how can critical thinking nurture a planetary consciousness?
It seems to me that we live in times that are somewhat paradoxical. They are paradoxical in the sense that our world, the Earth with capital E, has never been as unified as it is today. Unified thanks to a large extent to the technological progress humanity has experienced over the last, I would say, two centuries. The level of our technological development makes it such that today the sense of belonging to the same earth, that sense objectively is almost palpable. Yet the world has never seemed as fractured as it is today. Fractured along multiple lines, identitarian lines, ethnic lines, religious lines, racial lines as well, deep inequalities within nations and between nations. And one has to add a desire for endogamy, a desire for separation, and a desire for apartheid, to use a term that is, if you want, extremely loaded. So, for me, the planetary, or for that matter, planetary consciousness, is in fact an aspiration. It's an aspirational category in the sense that a lot of the vital challenges we face today are not at all limited to one country, one region, or for that matter, one continent. Most of those vital challenges are planetary in nature. And on my mind, the planetary is not exactly the same thing as the universal. The universal, as we know, is a category that has been critiqued a lot, not least by thinkers coming from the global south, because of its imperialist, let's say, imperialist traces which underpin it. The planetary is objectively the kind of shared space and shared moment we live in, which, as I said early on, is extremely paradoxical. So the challenge for critical thinking is therefore today to leave behind the kind of provincial positioning which has characterized dominant or hegemonic ways of thinking, most of which we have inherited from the West. Planetary thinking is about decentering. It's about the injunction to decolonize, meaning to find ways of thinking that take seriously our common belonging to an earth which for its own sustainability and durability has to be shared, has to be cared for, and most importantly has to be repaired.
So when you call for a planetary consciousness, is this consciousness that the earth is what we inhabit and we inhabit it in common? But as I understand it, it doesn't only concern human beings, but it concerns everything.
Yes.
Is this planetary entanglement that you talk about other places? So it's all species, all life, but also non-life. Is that right?
Yes. It is the place we all inhabit. It is the place we all inherit. But we humans, our tenure on Earth is not unlimited, and both from an individual perspective and a collective perspective. There will come a time when our tenure on Earth will come to an end. When, I cannot tell you, but that's absolutely a historical possibility. And in any case, if we keep treating it the way we have so far, the likelihood of these post-historical moment coming in, and the likelihood is, according to scientists in any case, perfectly conceivable. So when we talk about the earth, we have in mind precisely this unique location, cosmic location, which is a hospitable, a refuge and a home to everything and everyone. So there's a radical openness to all, with capital A, in this sign called the Earth, which for me epitomizes indeed the planetary, I should say the cosmic.
Mm-hmm. But still there is a question of like, how can we bring this consciousness about? Because we can sit here and agree that this is a good way of thinking, or a necessary way of thinking our life today. But what are the conditions for, because you're talking about critical thinking and the critical thinking as a way of kind of achieving this consciousness at the same time as I know and you know and a lot of people know that the status and the conditions for critical thinking today has changed. So we hear quite often that critique has run out of steam, or that there is a flight from theory. Yet, for example, in your essay, Planetary Entanglements, you argue that theory and critical thinking is not so much dead. Indeed, it is more important than ever as it is displaced. Abstract theory, you write, has never had such a hold on the material and social reality of the world as it has today. But the kind of abstract theory you talk about here is, as you point out, the particular power of economic abstractions, as well as evolutionary theory, sociobiology, cognitive sciences, genetics, neurosciences. And needless to say, these kinds of theoretizations opens for visions of the human, which we might say is a far cry from the older vision of critical theory as a capacity to transform existing structures of power and to imagine alternative social arrangements. Or are they perhaps not? Is there a way from the current status of critical theory that it's possible to bring forward this alternative vision? Could you elaborate a bit on this and perhaps say something about what is the relationship between what you call theory and critical thinking today?
Okay, that's a very, very complex question. Let me try to answer it from a very practical standpoint. We live in a world which is driven and saturated by big data. In a world in which confusion increasingly reigns between knowledge as such and information. When knowledge is equated with information. Information expressed in abstract language. Abstract in the sense that when it is not statistical, it is increasingly coded in the form of algorithms. In the sense that reason, the old human faculty of reason, is itself increasingly replaced by computing, the computational. That we have moved from the age of the machine to the age of the computer. And therefore, is real what can be computed. And it doesn't exist that which is not computable. To the extent in which life itself has become a computable object. There's no way to be more abstract than that.
Oh.
There's no way to be more...
It does influence how we think about ourselves, how we think about
Definitely.
each other,
Yes.
how we think about the earth.
Yes, and how we think about the world at large, and how we relate to that world at large. It means that the kind of, let's say, reason, in its classical sense of the term, has been replaced by instrumental reason. But instrumental reason is not the whole of reason. So because of this shift, the kind of critique of instrumental reason that was elaborated not so long ago by the Frankfurt School, for instance, and the rest, that critique has to be redeployed anew, but in an era which, as I was saying a moment ago, is no longer really the era of the machine, but is the era of the computer. So the, let's say, theoretical endeavor has to be reconceptualized within these new conditions.
That is actually, because that brings me over to the next point, actually, because as I see your work as a whole, it is a series of redeployments and rewritings and reworkings of kind of standard debates, standard terms, and so on, that which you can call actually an effort to reinvigorate the possibilities as well as modes of thinking critically, and you do so.
But in order to do that, let me just add, we can no longer only rely on one kind of library. Because, I mean, the Western library, basically.
Precisely, yeah.
Which to some extent has led us into the kind of cul-de-sac we find ourselves. In order to rekindle the theoretical project, critical theoretical project, we absolutely need to draw on the multiple libraries that humanity has invented.
You have a term that you use, which is thinking the world from Africa, which I see as not like a model or like a set perspective, but more like a project or an assistance that we need to look at things from different places and not stop using Western concepts, for example, because you yourself use a lot of terms and concepts from the Western tradition, but to kind of displace them as if with using a different library or other thinkers. Like Frantz Fanon, for example, is very important for you, but many others too. So in that sense, it's kind of also like an effort to shift the geography of reason, which is a term I really like, but not to kind of replace something, but displace and think anew. And I want to come back to that, but I thought that maybe first we could look closer at some of your many publications and to see how you do it, like, because you have written extensively for 40 years. And I think we could reread a lot of your writings from the theme of thinking the world from Africa. And what I wanted to concentrate on in this regard is what I see as a structuring and recurring theme in your thinking, namely the relation between power and violence. Especially as it regards colonialism, racism, politics, but also resistance, democracy, the possibility of thinking hope. And when you do think about this, you propose a series of different terms or maybe figures to conceptualize this relation between power and violence, from the post-colony to necropolitics and to brutalism. So I just wanted to start out with this notion of the post-colony, which is one of your most important books from 2001, which also has a specific figure of how power works. And here you talk about colonial sovereign power in terms of commandment, a sort of divine libido, so to speak, which, as you point out, not only operated to seize the land and to seize the resources, but also restructured its inhabitants as cheap and disposable labor along the axis of native, slave, animal. So this form of power had enormous consequences, not only economically and politically, but also psychologically. So what you want to capture with this analysis, as I understand it, is a more precise description of the very sensory life of power. Can you elaborate a bit on this?
I don't have a direct experience of colonial rule. I was born at the moment when colonial rule ended. So I grew up in a context in which power was exercised by African people themselves.
Mm.
Not out of nowhere, of course. They exercised it in a way which kept a number of attributes of pre-colonial forms of rule, colonial forms of rule, and new modes of managing people typical of post-colonial societies. And I did observe that a lot in these new modalities of exercising power, a lot was very practical. Mm-hmm. It was very material. It had to do with bodies, actual bodies. It also had to do with nerves, people's sensations, and their way of inhabiting their environments, their habitats. So on the post-colony is an attempt at, let's say, grappling with this mode of exercise of power which targets the body of the governed. Mm. That's why the book was written in the way in which it was written. It was an attempt at doing for our times the kind of work Frantz Fanon did under colonialism, when he tried to account for, let's say, colonial modes of governmentality. So that was it then, but it was part of broader discussions, spirit of the times, in which the discipline of political science was developing, at least for me, an analysis of African social formations, which was falling short of the experiential, an attempt at bringing that experience into discourse, to academic discourse.
Mm-hmm. Talking about Fanon, because as I read, it's very inspired by Fanon, and also the ending on the post-colony. You almost end in the same way as Fanon and his Wretched of the Earth, saying that we have to create a new kind of man, or a new kind of being, or a new kind of
remember,
human.
is it in the Wretched of the Earth or in Black Skin, White Mask?
Yeah, I think
anyway, Fanon always ended his books in a flamboyant manner. Yeah. But mine was less Fanonian. It was more Nietzschean. I mean, I was reading Nietzsche a lot.
And you end with a quote by Nietzsche, right? Like that. You have to kind of.
But I guess, I mean, there's some. I don't know whether this work has ever been done, but I think one can read Nietzsche and Fanon in the same gesture. Put them in conversation. I'm sure it would produce.
Yes, and we can do it through your work on the post-colony.
So that's what I try to do with On the Post-colony.
But
On the Post-colony was written, I wrote it at night. Most of the book was written at night. And
that's why it's so dark? Because a lot of people have said that the work is really, really dark, and then you say that
it's not at all. No,
because you want to kind of bring some hope or light or change.
Of course. No, it's not. People don't read very well. I'm afraid to say. It was written at night, for one reason, because I mean I'm more active at night than during the day. My mind works better at night. In any case, then. Nowadays, I'm not sure of that. But, I wrote it when I was still in America. And so you have a little bit of a distance. I was not in Africa. I mean, it's one thing to write from Africa. It's one thing to write about Africa from outside of the continent. That's, in any case, how I feel it. And I wrote it while listening to music. Not whatever kind of music.
What kind of music?
I mean, Congolese music. And for those who know Congolese music, Congolese music is extraordinarily material. In the sense that it is the expression of the deep forces, deep rhythms, which are so typical of African musical forms of creation. So I was listening to that music and writing the book. So for anyone who is knowledgeable about Congolese music and who reads On the Post-colony, anyone who is knowledgeable of this can find in the book the rhythms of the music as the words keep piling up and forming this text. That's why I say, in one sense, it is more Nietzschean than Fanonian. Anyway.
But also this kind of like sensory take on, not on the power, but life and how everything is kind of like integrated or entangled in a way.
You see, the other thing that is really interesting, because I was doing that, listening to Congolese music, but also reading literature. Reading some key authors who, for me, have been absolutely faithful companions for anyone who is trying to make sense of what has happened after colonialism.
Like Amos Tsotola?
Sonila Butansi, a fabulous author in the vein of Garcia Marquez. Sonila Butansi, on the one hand, Amos Tsotola, older than Sonila Butansi, Yambo Wologem, who wrote Le Devoir de Violence, which was a key text, which for me is still absolutely central to literary forms of creation in the continent, and a number of others, Amadou Kourouma, etc.
But
So
also,
what I was saying, in fact, literature had more or less dealt with it, and dealt with it with more precision, with more power and energy than so-called scientific academic discipline, social scientific thought. So the book is an attempt at crafting a conversation between these different genres. Yeah.
And of course, a lot of people have also pointed out that your own writing is also poetic in many ways, or bordering on the literary. And I was really taken back or inspired when I read your later comment to the critics on post-colony. And when you were talking about this kind of like sensory...
You see, you're right. I mean, first of all, the point you are making is, what is it to write? And what is it to write Africa? See, what is it to write Africa? And I say Africa because the reality is that in the modern library, in the modern archive we have inherited, all of us, before you say anything about Africa, there's always a prior statement about it, which has made it such that many African thinkers have spent a lot of their vitality, energy, intelligence in the business of refutation, because there is a prior discourse which tells you what Africa is all about, how to think about Africa. Most of it mythological. So when you start talking about it, it's always somewhat in relation to that prior discourse, which you have to, let's say, push aside in order to say anything new. But the fact is that many people get exhausted just for trying to push aside the mythological and never get to, enunciating what it actually is. We know more about what it is not than about what it is. Yeah. So on the post-colony is trying to intervene in that space and to introduce a fracture, une fission, to insert, let's say, open up a tiny space in order to, let's say, produce an explosion. But when you want to produce an explosion, that's why it is an incendiary text. You have to go look for the proper material. And the proper material is in music, it is in literature, it is in a number of, maybe you really want to go deep, in deep cosmologies, cosmogonies, most of which are to be deciphered from, let's say, African figural texts, African sculpture, for instance.
But that also brings me back to the question that we were talking about, like with critical thinking. Because when
those are the resources in case you are really interested in a critical thinking project from the continent. Where do you go looking for the ingredients?
But not only
what words, what notions, categories, concepts, where do you go looking for them? What work is it that they do in their original ecology? And when you take them away from there and put them in the realm of this kind of international lingo, we will all exchange. But where words don't necessarily mean exactly the same thing. So the new kind of critical thinking I have in mind is one that does that archaeological work or genealogical work, and one that is knowledgeable of a variety of traditions, of languages too.
Yeah, because not the least, yeah.
When you come from Africa and you have studied within the French system, you have to know that system And you have to know your own system. So you have to partake of a variety of traditions, using one tradition against another, drawing on the inner resources of those different traditions, because the best critique of the Western tradition is the Western tradition itself.
And now we're not talking about like different context, but also different way of inhabiting the world through language, music, because you also mentioned figuration. As figuration is not a systematic kind of abstract theory, but it is a way of doing critical thinking.
Yes.
Which also somewhat reminds me of Gayatri Spivak's kind of like
that's
thinking.
Where, I mean, you see, that's where Africa is such a reserve of power, which we haven't even, I mean, in most disciplines, we haven't even explored, I would say, 10% of what exists. Because people believe that African civilizations are oral civilizations. That's partially true. Because thinking, or the exercise of thought, in fact, it operated through images and objects. And objects were images. When you see an African sculpture from the Congo, from the Dogon region in Mali, or from old Yoruba kingdoms, it's an image. It's a way of writing with images and of thinking with images.
And perspectives too,
Absolutely.
right?
The spoken word is not at the beginning. Not at all. It's not like in the logocentric so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, where at the beginning was the word. No.
In the beginning it was a figure, or in the beginning was a figuration?
An image. Was the image and the object. The image objectified in the object. So you have to start from there. It's an entirely different way of thinking.
And of course that way of thinking also revolutionized Western art in the early 1900s with Picasso and all these people taking up
what they understood.
That's what they understood.
They understood it, but as it often happens in, I mean, let's just be generic, in the West, when the West deals with
yes, because they were the ones
that came
up
with it. They bring it to themselves, and so they feel that there is something unique here, but very quickly they reduce it to themselves, and do not deal with it on its own terms.
And then they pretend that they thought of it in the first place.
And of course they pretend that they are the originators of it. But that we know. Now, once we know that, the next step is to go deeper. And that's why I'm saying that, in that sense, in the face of the types of crisis the world is experiencing now.
And that's what also like thinking from Africa can bring into also kind of nurturing this planetary consciousness.
Absolutely.
Like but I need to go back to this violence and because that's also I know you say in an interview with the Norwegian newspaper Morgenbladet earlier this year that there is kind of like two trajectories to your thinking, one that deals with violence, with suffering, with crucifixion, actually you say, and the other one that deals with hope, resurrection, and the futurity, but somehow they are intertwined all the time. And I think that also opens up for a new perspective of reading on the post-colony, which many have seen as a very dark book, but there is kind of like inscribing hope at some extent. And you also comment in your later thinking about the book, about the conversation you have with Fanon in this book, that there is one point that the two of you kind of disagree, and that's where Fanon actually talks about violence, the necessity to meet violence with violence, is kind of like upholding of death regimes, whereas you kind of want to kind of talk about life, to break the death cycle and talk about life. But still, you also...
See, Fanon, the problem with Fanon is that he... I mean, the problem. I mean, Fanon had two faces. There's the Fanon who witnessed the debasement of the human through colonialism, because that's what the colonial project was all about. It's about really crushing the human in the other, the person in the other. It's about really making it impossible for that other to breathe. And there's a lot about breathing in Fanon's work. One could write a whole dissertation on the act of breathing and the politics of breathing. So he had witnessed the human in its state of, extreme state of desacralization, of fragmentation, bodily fragmentation, nervous fragmentation, landscape of ruins, etc. And when one reads his text, that figure of the human, of the patient, in fact, shouldn't even talk about the patient, is absolutely central. The question being, how is it that we bring back the patient into a possible potential state of integrality? How do we reconstitute the body and the mind so that they form a unit, a viable unit? So you have that figure of the patient. And you have the figure of the human who is standing up against colonialism and is risking everything in the struggle against colonialism.
Almost like Sartre, you have to
absolutely.
be your...
That's where the violent part comes in. But Fanon is not a believer. Fanon, there's nothing in Fanon which suggests that he might have been in some kind of dialogue with, let's say, the transcendent, the absolute. Let's not even call it God. So I think that's where lies the difference. Not that I'm a believer, but I grew up in a context in which what you see is not all that there is. Where in fact what you see is always a reflection of something deeper, which you have to decipher, something even mysterious, something which in fact you will never be able to know fully, where the idea of total knowledge doesn't exist where I grew up. Which means that you have always constantly to create a space, leave a place for that which is not expected, for those other vital forces one has constantly to compose with.
But is that something that you hold on to then, to further this idea of life contra death?
Yes,
is that
because that's where life is, precisely. And that kind of life you find there is not at all computable. In fact, is incalculable. Completely incalculable. It's a different paradigm. It's not exactly, sorry to keep using such terms, the Western paradigm, where, of course, the human is at the top, at the apex. Everything else is at his or her disposal, and the universe is there to serve him or her. It's not at all that. It's more horizontal, let's say, ecology, where, in fact, there is a recognition of the existence of multiplicity of forces. And you can only survive in such a context if you are able to craft alliances of a variety of forms with everything else. Where agency, if you want, is by definition shared.
So is that how you then explain spirituality? Because just to come back to more
I don't want to use
again,
the term spirituality.
No. No, because you're quoted there saying something that you cannot imagine radical politics apart from spirituality.
Yes,
that they
let's
have
use that
to be
term,
kind of
if you
like,
want.
yeah.
Yes. What I mean is, without that element, that moment when there's a recognition that I'm not all, that in fact they are other forces I have to compose with. That recognition then can go as far as translating into potentially religious terms. But the recognition of a power that is more powerful than mine, I think you don't find it in Fanon, for instance.
No, because I took it in a completely different direction when I read it, but that's also because I have been inspired lately by the Turkish writer Achille Mbembe, who has this juxtaposition between hope and faith.
Yes.
And she's not a believer either, but she thinks that the whole idea of faith is so important to thinking radical politics today, because you can hope for all these kind of things. But if you really have faith, you have faith in life, you have faith that things will go well, you have faith in the universe, that also opens for another way of believing and doing, on strength and endurance in keeping with this radical politics, or even nurturing this planetary consciousness, that you have faith in it.
Yes. You see, some time ago we were called upon to contribute to a book on Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela has written two books. There's one called Long Walk to Freedom, which is a typical his political kind of history. And then there's another book which is called Conversations with Myself, which is not at all, not many people talk about it. It's not at all the object of any academic or even just critical consideration. But personally, I found it to be tremendously rich, because it's a book that grants a huge space to Mandela in prison at the height of his incarceration. During those really difficult years, when he was not only banished, but they really want to kill him not physically but mentally. And then he had to undergo a deep experience of transfiguration. I will use that theological language. Transfiguration meaning that a process whereby you turn yourself into somebody else. And he explains in the book how this happened, how he did it. And which makes me then believe that it's a matter of faith, of course, a statement of faith, but it's also a commitment to a certain form of praxis. You cannot go out, change the world, if you do not somewhat develop somewhere a capacity to change yourself. And part of what is missing today in the kinds of performance of radicalism or of purity we see emerging here and there, whether from the so-called left or from the right, is a set of theatrics which are external but never really touch the internal. Never really open up a space for that kind of, the Greeks called it metanoia, that transfiguration, at the end of which we become somebody else. So it seems to me that authentic radical politics has to be premised on that willingness to undergo that process. Otherwise, it's spectacle.
Which also, because you're also talking somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, this kind of like radical care of the self, because it's also related, this kind of transformation is also
but
related
he talks
to some
about it.
care.
But
Yeah.
most of those real revolutionaries of that time, Mandela, Gandhi, even people like Nehru, when you read the text that they have written, some of whom have been in jail. I mean, jail is really it can't understand.
You have to think.
Not that we all have to go to jail, but I believe that, I mean, to be a really good revolutionary, you have to spend some time in jail. Because then you are facing yourself. There's no way in which you can blame somebody else. You have to put yourself on trial and get through the eye of the needle, as they say in the gospel. So that going through the eye of the needle, I think, is something I find absolutely important for the task of personal transformation.
But we're also talking about some really great thinkers and great leaders, and also great thinkers that embraced peace, peacefulness, life, not death, non-violence in all kind of ways. But then, of course, there are those really big masses today that live under completely different circumstances, where they're not put in jail, where they don't have time for themselves, but they are met with these kind of extreme forms of violence. Is there faith in that position too? Or
no, there's no faith there. I mean, there's a lot of agitators around. I mean, they are. The period we live in is full of noise. Too much noise. And a lot of superficiality. I'm sorry to use that term. I think that the political, in the sense in which one finds it in Mandela and the likes, requires less noise. It requires...
Or another form of knowledge, maybe. Or no, yeah, not knowledge in this.
No, I'm talking about noise, yeah.
Or noise.
Yeah, noise. That there's too much noise.
There's too much noise.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's too much. And there's, I mean, the likes of Simone Weil and the others. It requires moments of meditation, meaning, once again, to use Christian language, a moment of contemplation of the cross. You were mentioning the metaphor of crucifixion, but crucifixion as a step on the path towards resurrection. Because crucifixion, at least in theological Christian language, is not the last word of the story. It's never the last word of the story. The last word of the story is this event, the event in fact, in the writings of the likes of St. Paul, which when uttered makes you appear as a madman in a world in which reason has reached its own limits, because it can't really factor that kind of scandal in its operation. So it's something like that.
But at the same time then, there's too much noise, and of course, but isn't it also a privilege for some then to be able to withdraw from this noise, and not everyone can do that?
Unfortunately not.
No.
Fewer and fewer people are able to have the luxury of withdrawing.
So I just wanted you to say something about the concept of necropolitics, because that is maybe your most famous concept, or like the concept that a lot of people think of when they hear Achille Mbembe. They think necropolitics, but that's a term from 20 years ago, and it is kind of like production of zones of death, or these creations of populations that are living in a zone where there's really no difference between life and death, and you link it to the plantation economy, but you link it to things that are going on today, Palestine, for example. You link it to modern warfare, which kind of like just go in and have mass destructive weapon to kind of to create as much destruction as they can. But the more radical theory, of course, is that, because you're talking with Michel Foucault here and his notion of biopolitics, that all kind of biopolitical regimes, or modern democracies, as we like to call them, depends on or builds on this construction of these death zones. But could you say something about the afterlife of this concept and how it's also still relevant?
You see, I used it in the first instance in an article that was written after 9/11. Because after 9/11, at least in the academic world, in some of the disciplines, in particular in political philosophy, in political theory, international relations, there was raging a debate on the question of sovereignty after 9/11. Because with the event of 9/11, the US had arrogated to itself the power to wage what it called then war on terror, which had two characteristics. First of all, it was a war that was supposed to be without end. It didn't have an end. And second, it was a war that was supposed to be conducted in a total absence of any law of war. And as we know, I mean, the international system rests on a set of laws. Humanitarian law, laws of war, laws of the sea, etc. So the moment you decide as a sovereign act to engage in a war that has no end, meaning perpetual war as opposed to the Kantian dream of perpetual peace, and a war without laws, lawlessness as a principle of non-cohabitation, in fact, because if we only have one earth, and if for its durability and our own, we have to cohabit, we have to share it, then the moment you engage in a lawless, endless war, what you are refusing is the very principle of cohabitation. So the text, Necropolitics, which was then published by Public Culture, the journal, these are its origins. So then I go into, let's say, some key theories of sovereignty in the Western archive, which were then prevailing. And I try to read them against, of course, these long, deep historical experience of people who have really undergone quasi-extinction, who have been at the receiving end of the kind of violence the US is now then trying to. And then reinterrogate the concept, but from that historical experience. That's the plantation, the colony, later
which is also a way
colonial
of
occupation.
thinking a present kind of problem from Africa.
Yes, yeah, which is, you see what? Okay, fine, sovereignty. But from where? Who is speaking? Can we read it from its underneath? Reading it from its underneath, what does it reveal? That's necropolitics. The deliberate creation of deathscapes, modes of rule, in which life is instrumentalized, is put at the service of forms of power which rest on the capacity to kill, on killing projects. And how do they manifest themselves historically at different epochs? That's what I try to do. And you're right that it's a concept that has had a lot of resonance. I wouldn't be able to tell you nowadays, what it means, frankly, because it has been put to so many, at the service, so many projects that it's just good to let it do its own work.
You don't think in terms of necropolitics any longer?
Oh, no. I mean, brutalism.
Which is a different kind of power.
It's a different kind of, yes.
Yeah.
It is a different kind of power.
So maybe you would then, because then we can move on to brutalism in a certain way. Because when you talk about brutalism, you talk about as one way of this is a very bleak kind of power, I think. But you take the term from architecture, but the imagery that you bring forth for the reader is of this kind of like demolition place. You demolish everything and then you build up these really huge black blocks of concrete. And that's what you do to humanities in a way today with computational thinking, neurobiological thinking, or the neurobiological economy, the carbonization, the extensive land grab, and I must say also sea grabs, talking from from Norway, and also this depletion of energy, or making humanity into this energy source or biocode that can be harvested. And you also kind of liken it to this, the becoming black of the world, in a certain sense, that this restructuring of humanity as a resource that can be used and then just disposed of at a point. And here you also talk about a lot of borderization, that borderization is one of the mechanisms that is also included in this brutalism thinking. So maybe migration policies can be better described through brutalism than necropolitics. I don't know.
Let's see, maybe there's a point where they intersect. But you're right that of course it looks bleak, but what's going on around? You just have to open your eyes. What we have been taught to do is to, first of all, look into those occurrences as episodic, meaning, okay, they happen by accident. No, they don't happen by accident. They increasingly happen by design. They happen by design. And if they happen by design, then the task of the critique is to delineate the modalities of this designing. And
because they don't come from one place, they come from several places.
No, of course, of course. Of course they do. Of course they are underpinned by an economy. All of them. There's money at work. So if that is the case, then we have to look into it. And it's massive. We're talking about the planetary, because nowadays the platform economies, they operate at that level. But we have been taught to distinguish things, cut them off. Say we have what? Let's say, put here on the table a computer. And we think, oh yeah, the economy is becoming dematerialized. We can only say that if we delink the end product, the computer, from the work that is being done in places like the Congo or other parts of Africa to extract the material which is used to build the computer. But if we connect the two, then we see an entirely different reality. So that's the work that I'm trying to do in brutalism, using exactly the lines of inquiry you have mentioned: migration, borders. I mean, how do borders operate today? How come, for instance, in the Mediterranean border of Europe, how come as many people have been killed or have died as in Gaza? You don't have high altitude bombardments in the Mediterranean. And yet, at the end, you harvest more than 30,000 people dead. Can we just, the collateral damage? What's going on? So it's that kind of, at a time when we see very well that the world is in a state of combustion. If we are to look into all the studies by scientists, that it's heating up. And if we look into the consequences, both epidemiological, biological, organic, of extreme heat, what is it that it produces? Maybe for the time being it produces it in the Kalahari, but soon it will be producing it everywhere. What is that kind of, what is coming? What's coming?
Your book, After Brutalism, is precisely the earthly community.
Yes, after brutalism, yes.
Yes, after brutalism.
But you can see the earthly community building up, in fact, from on the post-colonial.
Yes, and it is a reflection on the last utopia. So here you have the utopian thinking again, and you also return to this question of like thinking the world from Africa, because in the opening chapter, The Universal Right to Breathe, which of course is an older article, you list 3 reasons why it's necessary or to think the world from Africa, or what it can give us. And you mentioned, of course, like the old, when you're talking about the Dogon masks and the relationship to others and to death and life, that is one of the things. Another trajectory, of course, is that the demographics is moving. Like Europe is dying in some kind of like sense. The population is getting older, the birth rate is dropping, whereas you have so many other places that it's so much younger, invigorating, things are happening in other places, and a different kind of like history to draw on. And an older laboratory of what it means to transform, what it means to live, that hasn't been used yet or hasn't been sufficiently explored. And you have some beautiful thinking there, but because you're also very critical to the nation state as such, right? And the nation state, we could say that is founded on necropolitics. But you talk about like thinking the earth. Could you maybe end on this note of thinking the world from Africa in utopian terms? And what is the place of utopia today? Utopia has been so much criticized.
It has.
Naive and also authoritarian, because if you think of a utopia, you think of an ideal society that you should reach, and then when you reach it, of course, it turns out to be hell for everyone.
Yes. But I think we have to redeem the utopian capabilities which are part of who we are. We need stories. I mean, impressed by the fact that the need for stories is absolutely critical in the making and the becoming human of the world. And therefore, utopia is, in any case, part of the ineradicable. It's one of those needs we cannot eradicate, however we try. Why? Because it's the career of a power which constantly exceeds that which aims at limiting it. Question being, okay, what do you do with that excess? How do you relate to the excess, that which exceeds the existing? And Africa is a very living figure of the excess. The excess in that sense, not the excess in the negative sense of that which overflows for no reason.
But excess of possibilities,
yes,
really.
Of course.
Which you
excess
also talk about on the post-colony.
Yes, yes, definitely. And out of the dark night, the introduction is about that Africa as a power in reserve and a reserve of power. The two combined. And if we take seriously the African continent at that deep level, then we begin to see, the incredible potentialities it is made of. it houses. The question of how it is that we render those potentialities actual, of course, a question we have to deal with. I'll tell you one thing. Over the last 2 years or 3 years, I've been doing less and less academic work. I have been setting up from Johannesburg a foundation called the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, which intervenes in the whole of the continent. It has been operating for more or less 1 year now. It has its imprint in 24 countries. By the end of this year, we'll extend it to 30 or 32 countries, Francophone, but also Anglophone and Lusophone. The virtual community that we have built around the foundation comprises between 22 to 23,000 people, most of whom age between 20 years and 35 years. Most of whom are either women, professionals, artists, leaders of local associations, new coalition of social forces who believe that the time for Africa, it's up to the generation to precipitate it. Through what? Through the rearming of thought, of critical faculties, of which we have been talking about, through the support, actual financial support to concrete initiatives going on the ground, whether they deal with youth education, whether they deal with people building a library so that young people can read, whether it's about setting up, they call it in French, cercle de soins et de la parole, spaces, free spaces for the free expression of those whose voice is usually neglected. A whole set of concrete initiatives like that, linking them up because most people in the continent is huge. Most people work in isolation, so that I know when I work in Nigeria that, in fact, next door in Ghana, there's somebody more or less facing the same challenges, and if we work together, we'll become stronger. Using all the, let's say, possibilities opened up by new technologies, investing some of those social networks to produce data, different types of data, different types of information. We are doing all of that, in addition, of course, to open-ended research, to training of a younger generation of experts, etc. So that's how one operationalizes a utopian project. Here the utopia is what? The utopia consists in envisaging collectively a form of democracy that could be substantive. We call it substantive democracy. Substantive democracy meaning a democracy that is capable of attending to people's vital needs, material needs, but also a democracy that is, let's say, in rupture with a long history of necropolitics, of which it has been associated over a long time. So how do you make sure that the history of democracy and the history of necropolitics are no longer the same? So it requires, of course, launching of imagination, relying on artists, on music, on poetry, on literature, all forms of expression which are so typical of contemporary young urban Africa. So look, that's for me is part of the politics of faith and the politics of hope you were talking about. And I wanted to maybe end with that concrete example of how one moves from, let's say, high theory to high practice in contemporary conditions.
I think that was an excellent place of ending this talk, coming back to both what critical thinking can do to the world and how we can make new utopias or to keep on to this utopia, think critically from Africa. So I'm looking forward to reading about your experiences, and thank you very much, Achille Mbembe, the winner of the Holberg Prize 2024.
Thank you very much.